Today is the last lesson on Titus, and there's no lesson next week because my wife and I will be traveling for our 10-year anniversary. So we'll be reading Jude for 2 weeks from now. Jude is only 1 page long, so try to read it every day for the next 2 weeks. And while you're doing that, try to figure out who is the group he's talking to and the group he's talking about. And basically, what is he saying to and about these groups? Now, let's finish up Titus. Have you ever known a really argumentative person? They're quick to point out when you're wrong. Don't you just love people like that? They're so pleasant to be around. Those kinds of people are frustrating. It seems like they want to have something to confront others about. Maybe they enjoy putting other people down. Maybe they like to feel superior. Or maybe they enjoy the power of being able to win an argument. I don't know, but I don't want to be that kind of person. Do you? However, there are lots of commands in Titus about confronting people and refuting people and silencing false teachers. Does that mean we're supposed to confront people every time they say something biblically wrong? Every time they say something theologically incorrect? Every time they say something sinful? No. Let's look at Titus 3:9. But avoid foolish debates, genealogies, quarrels, and disputes about the law, because they are unprofitable and worthless. Truth and morality are important and worth fighting for, worth arguing over. But there are plenty of arguments going on in churches that are unprofitable and worthless. There is a time to confront, and there is a time to keep your mouth closed. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Peacemakers. This doesn't mean appeasers or people pleasers who only say things that other people want to hear, like many politicians on both sides, very careful to never upset people because they don't want to lose votes. Jesus wasn't like that. Jesus upset plenty of people, which is part of why he got killed. The same thing with John the Baptist and Paul and Stephen, and the list of martyrs goes on, because when you stand up for truth, people will get angry. But you still can be a peacemaker. Hey neighbor, I'm sorry this happened. I know you're upset. How can I make this right? Now, Jesus was being very general. Be a peacemaker in life. But here in Titus 3:9, Paul is being more specific. In your church, over biblical issues, sometimes you must confront and silence people. And other times, you avoid quarrels and disputes about the Bible. So the question is, when should you agree? When should you disagree or confront? And when should you just let it go? Just ignore it. I used to work with a pastor who used to say this expression all the time. It was, "oh boy." But he would say it like this, "oh boy." And I remember telling my wife, "Do you ever notice that pastor says, oh boy, all the time?" And she laughed, and then it became sort of a running joke with me and her. We would say that, and it was partially just because it was a funny expression. But after he retired and I became the head pastor at that church, I very quickly realized why he said that. It wasn't just a little habit of his. It was for a very specific reason. People would come up to me all the time and say some horrible thing, and I couldn't agree with them, but it wasn't the right time to confront them about that. And so I needed to ignore it. That might work in a group setting. If someone says something and you just don't say anything. But in a one-on-one conversation, if somebody says something and you just ignore it, that's very weird. And also in our culture, that's actually a form of confronting them about what they said. So you have to say something or respond in some way. So sometimes they come up to me and say, Tom in the church who sits up front, he is such an obnoxious person, and we were trying to do something, he just kept getting in the way, and he's so stupid. And I would just say, oh boy. It was a way to respond. I heard you, but that's about it. That's all I'm saying when I say that. So when should you do that? The letting it go. And when should you confront? Let's start with times to just let it go. And you can let it go by saying, oh boy, or just by saying, sometimes that's all you need to do to let them know, I'm listening to you, but you don't give any more information. So here are times not to confront. If you're at a funeral, obviously, that's not a time to confront someone about a sin. You don't go up to someone and say, hey, I'm really sorry your father died. By the way, you really need to stop sleeping with your girlfriend. That's not the right time. You'll probably have to say that to them at some point, but that's not the right time to say it. Also, publicly, that's not the right time. If there's a group of people, you don't embarrass them publicly when confronting them about a sin issue, especially. Another time to not confront someone is if there's too much at once. In other words, if you do confront them about sleeping with their girlfriend and they say, you're right, I need to stop. It's just so blanking blank difficult. And it's just really blankety blank 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 difficult. That's when you think to yourself, right now I'm dealing with the sex outside of marriage issue. I can deal with language later. This is a much more important issue, and you don't do too much at once. You don't confront someone on more than one thing at one time, unless they're completely interconnected and you have to bring them both up. But in this case, of course you don't. So you just let it go and focus on the issue at hand. I mean, you're already in that little made-up scenario I just gave, you're already making good progress. The last time to not confront someone is if it won't do any good. It'll just draw you into foolish dispute, and it won't benefit anybody, and it won't be profitable or worthwhile. Just let it go. Side note, that's in your church. In your home, you probably need to let things go more often. People feel so free to criticize their family members whenever they feel like it. And those are the people you should be the most loving to, the most considerate of. That was a side note. Paul is talking about disagreements within the church. And we, specifically our little suburban American Christian subculture, we tend to have the opposite problem in church from what we have at home. At church, people don't confront people. We're just pleasant, and then we go gossip to our friends about them. Paul is saying you're going to need to let some things go in church and not get involved in foolish debates. But you will have to confront people sometimes. Look at the next verse, verse 10. But avoid foolish debates, genealogies, quarrels, and disputes about the law, because they are unprofitable and worthless. Reject a divisive person after a first and second warning. So avoid what you can. Love covers a multitude of sins. But sometimes you will need to reject someone. The NIV translates that reject word, translates that have nothing to do with him. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of exactly how you would go about doing that to someone in your church, other than to say, Matthew 18 sheds some light on the steps. You go to them privately, and if they don't listen, you take a few witnesses. And if they still don't listen, you do it publicly with the whole church. And if they still won't listen, then you do the rejection, having nothing to do with them thing. Notice how interesting this is. He says, avoid fights, but you will have to fight with some people who fight, right? Or avoid divisions, but you will have to divide from some people who cause divisions. Another way to look at this verse is avoid disputes. They are unprofitable. But if some people refuse to give up their disputing, you need to get rid of them. And then he goes on to say, for you know that such a person has gone astray and is sinning. He is self-condemned. He says, you know such a person is sinning. So you should only do this rejecting if it is a clear biblical violation. It needs to be clear and it needs to be serious. You don't reject someone or distance yourself from someone for something that's kind of questionable. You know, like the person who quit my church because my hair was too long. And it wasn't actually like long, like it hung down. It was just big. There's a picture of it. I'm sorry, that's embarrassing. This was like 20 years ago. It wasn't the pastor of the church or anything. They were looking for an excuse to quit the church, but they acted like, I must distance myself from you because I know that you have gone astray. So don't do this over questionable things. Do this over things that's clear and over things that are serious. Now, there are things that you may not think are serious, but God does. And causing divisions in the church is one of those things. God takes that very seriously. That's why 1 Timothy 5:19 says not to accept an accusation against a church leader unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. Gossiping about your pastor is one of the fastest ways to cause a division in your church. So if someone comes up to you and says, I heard that Pastor George is taking money out of the benevolent fund for himself, or any accusation, you should say, do you know that? Because we should not be perpetuating this rumor. So unless you have multiple witnesses or clear evidence, let's not talk about this. Now, granted, the tone and the words I just used are probably not the tone you want to use in that actual scenario, but that is what you basically have to say. You'll have to find maybe a softer way to say it to them, or maybe be that blunt, depending on the person, but you really can't be doing that. It's wrong and it's unbiblical to accept an accusation against a church leader without that kind of evidence. God takes it very seriously when people cause division in the body of Jesus Christ, in His bride, in His temple. The New Testament calls the church all 3 of these things: the body, the bride, and the temple of Almighty God. You can't just walk around cracking the walls of God's temple and expect Him not to punish you. And one of my kids goes around putting holes in the wall, cracks in the walls with a hammer of my house. Believe me, they're going to get punished and they're going to learn, I better not do that. So you may not like something that Pastor George decides or does or says, but he is the man that God put over you as your shepherd. And so you should have respect, even reverence for that. And not because he's a better person than you, but because God has put him in authority over you. In one sense, it doesn't matter what you like. You might be thinking, he'd better do and say what I like, or I'll just go to a different church. A, do you think you can outrun God's authority? I don't like who you put over me, God, so I'll just find my own person who will tell me what I want to hear. Is that going to work? And B, the whole idea of just leaving your church if you don't like something about it is a very unbiblical and ungodly attitude. It means that you think you're a customer and not a body part. A customer can just go to a different store if they're not pleased. An eyeball cannot just go to a different body. And that is very clearly used as an analogy of the church and the church members as parts of a body more than once in the New Testament. So you're not supposed to just leave your church. You're supposed to stay and deal with it. And dealing with it might mean that when Pastor George says, hey, you really need to stop gossiping, you don't say, I don't gossip any more than anybody else in this church. You say, you know what? You're right. Lastly, verse 11 says, he is self-condemned. It might seem harsh to reject a divisive person, to have nothing to do with them after only 2 warnings. It might seem wrong. It might seem judgmental. Only 2 warnings? What happened to 70 times 7? You're being judgmental and condemning. No, he's self-condemned. When you divide God's church, you condemn yourself. Because it is a joy and a privilege to be part of the body of Jesus Christ.